On April 17, 1961, the United States launched a covert invasion of Cuba, which resulted in complete failure. Powerful members of the CIA chose to compromise the agency's code of ethics, which are to collect, analyze, evaluate, and disseminate foreign intelligence to assist the President and senior U.S. government policymakers in making decisions relating to national security. They deliberately lied to the President and even other members of the agency. Their deliberate withholding of information led to a breakdown in communications, causing conflict between the White House and the CIA. Because of the breakdown in communications, the invasion turned out to be one of the most embarrassing incidents in President Kennedy's term as president and in our nation's history. In 1952, the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista took power over Cuba, establishing a corrupt government which catered toward the mafia and wealthy Americans. However, due to Batista's brutality, he had lost popularity among the Cuban people and they had grown weary of his tyranny. By 1957, a small underground resistance led by two Cubans named Fidel Castro and Che Guevara grew into total guerrilla warfare. Finally, after several months, they came down from the mountains of eastern Cuba and made a week-long march from one end of the island to the other, gathering support. On January 1st, 1959, Batista was overthrown. The Cubans rejoiced. Their new savior had come to free them from their chains of dictatorial reign, or so they thought. With Batista ousted, Castro traveled to Washington, D.C. to address the American Society of Newspaper Editors. During the visit, he was invited to meet with the then Vice President Richard Nixon. After the meeting, Nixon wrote a memorandum to President Eisenhower assessing Castro as a captive of communism. The CIA also had a secret meeting with Castro. Fooled by his charisma, they misassessed the young rebel, believing him to be, in fact, a Democrat, an advocate and supporter of democracy. Because they felt he was trustworthy, they decided to create a secret channel of information with him, relaying information to him about communist activities in Latin America. With this new channel of information, once again were the cards in his favor. In Cuba, the country was having an economic struggle and was in dire need of help. So to keep the country afloat, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for aid. Although he denied participating in communism, it was only a few months after the revolution when he began to publicly promote nationalistic policies that were incredibly similar to those of the United States' Cold War rival, the Soviet Union. The thought of a communist enemy 90 miles off the coast of Florida deeply concerned the Eisenhower administration. So on March 17, 1960, President Eisenhower approved a secret CIA plan to topple the Castro government. The plan called for a small group of anti-Castro Cuban political leaders who were then living in Miami to infiltrate Cuba and offer a democratic solution to Castro's government, hopefully sparking a revolution. Unfortunately, the infiltrators had failed to rally the Cuban people, and the U.S. determined that a new tactic was needed to overthrow Castro's government. So in early November, President Eisenhower authorized a new plan, which called for the use of anti-Castro Cuban exiles to overthrow the Castro government in a secret military operation. The group which they served in was known as Brigade 2506. Once recruited, the exiles were sent to train at a privately owned island off the western coast of Florida known as Usepa Island, covertly leased by the CIA. One day before the inauguration of President-elect John F. Kennedy, Eisenhower arranged a meeting with the soon-to-be leader. In effect, Eisenhower told him that the plan was already in motion and he strongly suggested Kennedy to move forward with it. The CIA's director at the time, Allen Dulles, a key player in the CIA's breakdown of communication, would later admit that the plan for Cuba was a sort of orphan child JFK had adopted, having no real love or affection for it. Now in office, Kennedy was faced with two ways of dealing with the problem. On one side, the CIA and the high military chiefs were known as the actionists, who advocated taking direct action against Castro. On the other side, some key aides to the president and high officials in the State Department were known as the how not to do it crowd. They, on the other hand, advised more conservative actions against Cuba. The arguments within the White House included these. U.S. action in Cuba would provoke resentment in Latin America and lose the U.S. friends in different parts of the world. It might even provoke the Soviet Union to retaliate, possibly kicking off World War III, and the action against Cuba would fail. These disputes led to delay in the plan's process. Meanwhile, Soviet arms, tanks, and jets were streaming into Cuba, causing Castro's military strength to grow. Despite the warnings of his how-not-to-do-it advisors, Kennedy just decided to proceed, but with a few changes made to the plan. The original plan was that the guerrillas would land at an area on the eastern end of Cuba called Trinidad. This Cuban village, known for being anti-Castro, made it a perfect landing site for the invasion. If the guerrillas were forced to retreat, they could easily escape to the Escambray Mountains and join up with the pre-existing anti-Castro groups there. However, if complications arose and they were unable to join up with those groups, then they would hide in the mountains, expecting their number to double over 1 week. Kennedy, however, feared this plan would easily expose the U.S.'s role in the invasion, and insisted that a new landing site be chosen. With this new proclamation, Kennedy gave the CIA just 3 days to come up with the new site. The CIA believed that when the invading forces hit Cuba, they would trigger thousands of Cubans to revolt against their oppressor. However, due to the poor swamp conditions and the geographic location of the proposed new landing site, the chances of the guerrillas linking up with the anti-Castro Cubans were completely diminished. Instead of fully informing the president of the risks involved with this new site, the CIA's Deputy Director of Plans, Richard Bishopp, deliberately withheld critical information from the president. One key piece of that information being that the location made it impossible for the guerrillas to seek refuge in the mountains. Instead of protesting against the proposed new site, Bishopp compromised his integrity and refused to reveal his cards, instead deciding to acquiesce to President Kennedy's demand. Even though Kennedy felt as though the invasion needed to be called off, Allen Dulles and Richard Bishopp pressured Kennedy to proceed. They feared that if Kennedy were to have called off the invasion, it could have been assumed that the pre-recruited guerrillas would become enraged over the plan's cancellation and carry out an attack against the U.S. Kennedy was cornered, and the CIA put him there. With all the plans set in place, it was finally time for the brigade to land. And on April 17, 1961, the small exile force of 1,500 men boldly faced 234,000 of their homeland soldiers. Once again, due to a lack of communications, the planes that the CIA promised would protect the guerrillas on the beach flew in an hour late due to time zone differences and were all shot down. The battle was a massacre. Almost 300 were killed in battle and nearly 860 were wounded. All day they pleaded for supplies and backup, but it never came. The exiles who remained say they felt completely abandoned. Finally, those who had escaped initial arrest were forced to give up. After they were captured, the exiles were sent to prison, where they were locked away for 20 months. After months of negotiation between Cuba and the U.S., in December 1962, the exiles were released, ransomed for $53 million worth of medicine and baby food. The Bay of Pigs disaster was a complete failure of U.S. foreign policy. It allowed Castro to assume a David versus Goliath image, gaining him significant support and ultimately cementing communism in Cuba to this day. It caused a blemish to form upon the face of the gleaming, shining new Kennedy administration, leaving the impression of a president who was weak and inexperienced. After the invasion, Castro feared another U.S. attack and asked for protection from the Soviet Union, the very thing the U.S. wanted to avoid. In turn, the Soviets struck a deal with Castro to turn Cuba into a Soviet missile base, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a famous saying stating that integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. By choosing to compromise their agency's integrity and principles, Allen Dulles and Richard Bishopp went behind the government's back, not fully informing them of the risks of the invasion. Whether they were actually conflicted within themselves is a question we may never answer, but the repercussions of their choices are clear.